simply because I know we're running out of time, and also because I'm one coffee ahead of where I should be. So trying to sort of keep it to a blur. So anyway, I was given the brief of talking around cities and urbanisation. I work at the African Centre of Cities, so I should know a lot about that. I'm not going to tell us that much about cities. I'm going to focus a little bit more on food in cities, simply because that's the angle that I work in. And also I think the city issue is so nebulous, it's quite difficult to grasp what might be some of the good Anthropocene lessons to come out of it. It's too large. So what I'm going to show first is just a little progression of urbanisation across the globe. So we're looking at 1950 to 2050. So past, present and future. And getting a sense of what this urbanising world looks like. So this is what the world looked like in 1950. The colour of the dots represents the proportion of the population of a country that lives in cities. The size of the dots represents just how many people there are. So you get the grasp in 1950 that we're looking predominantly at an urbanised world in the global north, with pockets in East Asia. But Europe, North America, that's where urbanisation is taking place. See what happens as we go into the future. So in 100 years, we have a vastly different world. We have the centre of urbanisation locating from north to south. We've got these burgeoning urban populations. And it's a very different world. And as Julian said, the pathway to development in the global south is very different than in the global north. Oh, I've skipped a slide. Okay, so this rapid urbanisation. Start of the 20th century, the urban population was 220 million. By the end of the 20th century, 2.84 billion. In the first 40 years of this century, we're going to see that number increase again. 93% of new urban growth is going to be in the developing world. So when we're thinking about what the world's going to look like, we've got to think about these massively growing urban centres. We tend to focus on the growth of the megacities, the Lagoses of the world, but actually an awful lot of urban development is happening in these smaller secondary cities, and there's not a lot of focus on what's going on there. These cities are generally less capacitated to cope with urban growth. The governance structures are weaker, infrastructure is weaker, the economy is often very centred on one industry, so they're quite vulnerable places. So we need to think about those kinds of things. And if we're thinking about what seeds of the good Anthropocene might be, what does it look like in these kinds of contexts? You know, we often try and learn from lessons from the global north, but urbanisation in the global south doesn't look like urbanisation in the global north. We've got infrastructure gaps, we've got population growth exceeding economic growth, but all these kinds of challenges. And a lot of this is unmapped, undocumented. People are not served by the infrastructure of the cities. So, you know, you've got people dropping boreholes all over the place drawing water, you've got people buying water left, right and centre. There's not this kind of state provision, there's not the roads, there's not all those things that we commonly think about. So how then do you think about a good Anthropocene in a largely unplanned context? So I'm going to break this down and talk more about the story of food in our cities and think around what some of the responses might be. Like I said, thinking about urbanisation is just too vast, to hone it in on things that we can grapple with. So 3 quick stories. The first one is of sugar and fat. Guys like Barry Popkin have done extensive work looking at nutrition transition, looking at how diets shift over time. And what they've been tracking is this growth of consumption of foods high in sugar and foods high in fat. And it tracks very nicely with this urbanisation trend. As you see people move to the cities, their diets are increasingly dependent on highly processed foods, increasingly dependent on foods with high sugar content, high fat content. In part, it's around a rise in income. But that's not the entire story, because if you compare households with similar levels of income in rural and urban areas, the urban areas are eating more crap. And so what's going on? Is it just personal choice? Well, no, it's around the structure of the markets, it's around what becomes available in those urban areas. But there's also these questions about what it means to live in cities and how you live, move and have your being shapes how you eat. So the dual income households, the time pressures of living in cities, all these shape the kinds of foods we're eating. So we need this shift towards convenience. Not only that, if you look at places like Kibera in Kenya, people are buying from takeaways, not because they lack the time to cook, but because of limited access to safe water, safe cooking facilities. And so that's an urban problem that's then shaping this dietary shift. So if we're thinking about, trying to address the problems of obesity and diabetes that Julian was talking about, we've got to understand the context in which we're working. The second story is of the rise of rice and the decline of sorghum in West Africa. Now the diet in West Africa is traditionally quite dependent on sorghum, and yet in places like Mali, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, we're seeing a surge in rice. And again, what's driving that? So yes, we talk about personal choice. We talk about, in urban areas, sorghum is seen as the kind of backward food of the rural people, and rice is seen as the westernized middle class, this is what we should be eating. But there's also a more complex narrative going on. So it's not just around this kind of sense of what's traditional and what's modern, although that's part of it. It's not simply around the time it takes to produce a sorghum meal versus the time it takes to produce a rice meal, which is part of the urban existence. But there's also around these big neoliberal policies that kind of have the cheap import of rice dumping from Asia, placing pressure on the efficiencies and economies of the sorghum production. So you've got to take these things all the way from these perceptions of what's modern and what's desirable to these meta-globalization issues around neoliberal economic policy. And so if we're thinking about these seeds of the Good Anthropocene, how do we connect those dots? The final story is around food waste. Historically, the cities are drawing food from all over the place, and we're producing an awful lot of waste. Historically, a lot of that waste went into productive systems in and around cities. That's declined. So Paris was essentially fed on its own shit for years. That's gone. Places like Nakuru in Kenya have a community composting project where communities compost and sell that to the agricultural areas outside the city. We don't have that done in Cape Town. We're producing vast amounts of food waste. We're trying to think of better ways to do that. What do we do with the waste? So there's projects like Food Bank, which have been very effective. But there's an awful lot of food that's still going to waste. I had a master's student a couple of years ago who was trying to look at, well, we know that urban agriculture projects struggle with getting enough good compost and good fertilizer. We know that supermarkets are generating a huge amount of waste. Surely there's got to be an opportunity. And so she spent a couple of years trying to unpack this. What do we do? How do we move on? And again, it seems a really obvious thing to do, but what are the barriers? What were the challenges? The challenges were around official policy didn't recognize food waste as a separate component of waste. It didn't recognize business waste as a separate component of waste. So you've got household and municipal waste. There was no business waste capacity. The supermarkets at head office saw waste as a potential resource. At the store level, saw waste as a necessary evil of doing business. And at the sub-store level, so the individual chain managers, so the people who are in charge of fresh produce, the people who are in charge of bakery, just saw it as something to get out. So you've got this language problem of food. Yes, we can view waste as a resource, but actually when you get down to who's actually managing the waste, it's just something to be got rid of. So there's this challenge of, well, how do we shift policy with a big P and a small p to make these obvious solutions actually work? So those are the things I want us to kind of bear in the back of our minds. The other thing, and I generally try and keep my theology out of what I do, but given Ashraf blowing doors open yesterday, here we go. I think, reading the materials that came in advance of this, it almost seems as if we're being as evangelical in our notion of the Good Anthropocene as any evangelical movement I've ever come across. And so Jim Hollis, who's a theologian quite big, says, if the gospel you're preaching isn't good news for the poor, then it isn't the gospel. So if we're paraphrasing, if the Good Anthropocene you're preaching isn't good news for the poor, then it's not the Good Anthropocene. And so I think, looking through the pockets that we discussed and looking through some of the ideas, we're finding a lot of very creative ideas. We're finding a lot of opportunities, but in the context of this urbanization and the urbanization of poverty and the challenges that Julian's spoken about, we need to make sure that what we're talking about connects into the lived realities of the urban poor, of the poor generally. And so that comes down to then understanding what actually is happening on the ground, not going through the idealized of what we'd love to happen, but actually what is going on. So within our work in AFSUN, we asked, and this was in 3 low-income areas of the city of Cape Town, where do you actually get your food from? Now I show this because it puts in some really important questions to us. It says, okay, well look, the market is a really dominant force. Now we can critique the market as much as we like, and I certainly do. But where are the ways in which we can harness that to more effectively deliver what we're looking at? How can we shift the market structures so that it does deliver economically, ecologically, and in terms of justice? If there's all this, sorry, I would stretch, but I plugged my neck up last night. If there's all this social capital, people sharing meals, people borrowing from people, there's some opportunities there. And then the final reason I always like to show this graph is simply the fourth column down. We spend an awful lot of attention trying to get people to grow food, but that doesn't seem to be the reality that we're in. So are we focusing on where the problem actually is, or are we missing some of it? Because this is a City of Cape Town urban agriculture project out in Atlantis. Yeah, I'm not seeing the new hope within that. Are we just playing back into a middle class ideal? Because we did a follow-up survey and we looked at wealthy, less wealthy and poorer income areas of the city and asked them, well, where are you getting your food from? And just the growing it component. Is this urban food production in cities actually just a middle class conceit? I don't know. I'm putting it out there. But if it is the obvious solution that we should be working to, why is it not the obvious solution to the poor? And if we're going to be encouraging that, how do we face that reality? So I think 3 points that I want us to maybe that I'm trying to work through are how do we deal with data gaps? Julian, you were saying there's umpteen sources of data. But actually, when we've been doing food work, we found there are massive data gaps. And the problem is that the data gaps there are actually reflect where a lot of the poverty pockets are. And so if we're using the available data, are we perhaps just telling the same old stories? So I'll illustrate that just now. We've been focusing a lot on pockets, and I think a lot of the time pockets are quite localized things, and we're looking at these kind of local points of engagement. We need to make sure, I think, that our points of analysis are not also just grounded at the local. So what is our scale of engagement, and is that always the same as our scale of analysis? And then always recognizing the power in the room. And so just to illustrate, we focus a lot at local food initiatives and local food systems and those kinds of things, but what's the meta-reality that these systems are trying to operate within? So we've been mapping out the distribution of supermarkets in Cape Town. I think most of you are from here, but for those of you who are not, the lighter colour on the map is the lower income areas, the darker colours are the wealthy areas. And we mapped out each and every supermarket that we could track down and just tried to get this progression. So 1994, 98, 2003, 2008, 2013. We've got this kind of rapid shift in what the geography of a city looks like. It's a geography of food, but it's a geography of economic development. Most of these shopping malls, most of these new supermarkets are in new shopping malls, which are shifting the economy of these local areas. And so if we're thinking about local initiatives, it's got to be mindful of some of these stories. And if you see this kind of progression that I've just shown, there's this kind of narrative of a big corporate marching over the food system. And that's, if we take that city scale analysis. But if we scale down, we get another set of stories coming through. So we mapped out, again, I'm a geographer, we map. It's what we do. But we mapped out each and every informal food retailer we could find in a couple of neighborhoods. And each cow is a meat trader, each little, I think that's a radish, each little green radish in a fruit and veg stand. Anyway, we've got this massive density of food retail. And it's small and it's local and it's not the big supermarket. Now we're trying to understand, well, what happens when the supermarkets move in? And it isn't this kind of bleak story of supermarkets move in and there's this scouring of informal food retailers. There's these interesting stories of symbiosis. And now, from my perspective, if we're looking at what a good Anthropocene example might be in the food system, it's around thinking, well, how can we harness on some of this existing energy? How can we encourage alternative food networks? How can we create more sustainable models within this? That's where I think some of our attention should be focused. And yet, at the policy level, all the focus is either on urban agriculture or on the enabling of the big formal food sector. And this is kind of missing. And so it comes back to this question about, well, what data is available? And whose voice does it privilege? So when we've been working with the City of Cape Town, we've been trying to tell them about these flows of food within the city, and they said, well, they're just kind of minor. There's, it's a couple of bucky smosa here and there. That's only if you take this particular scale vision of what you're doing. And so we need to, I think, be thinking around generating data that's going to help us challenge the status quo. We need to be thinking about how do you work at this very local scale, but hold these multiple scales of analysis and recognize what stories you can tell by what scale you're working at. And again, what are the power dynamics in these choices that you make? So coming back to the pockets, I spent a lot of time in the 90s wearing combat pants. You constantly find your keys, put on them at the start of the season, you pull out 20 rand or a tissue that had been left there also. So what are these pockets? We've kind of got all these stories that are popping up throughout the room. How do we start to connect them? In our group the other day, we were talking about the need for a kind of a compelling narrative, a story that's going to bind these things, because otherwise we're just going to end up with some really ridiculous looking clothes and not actually overthrowing the clothing paradigm as it stands. So how many pockets can we have until the garment no longer makes sense? How big can your pockets get before they ridiculous? I'm trying to find a way to round this talk up, and I don't think I've got it, so I'm just going to leave you